that you know what's coming than not. I'm going to focus a lot of today's presentation on the input side of things. There is no way you can have a healthy hog operation in a modern world without just massive volumes of soy and corn. They are by far the input that matters the most to you, and soy and corn production globally is going to shit. Except here. Here we've got where the corn comes from. Yikes. Ukraine number 4 has already fallen off the market. It is never coming back. Here's soy. Brazil is falling off the market and it is never coming back. How do you run a hog operation without soy or corn? Well, the answer is you don't, or at least it's not for export. So either you can access it or you're out of business. Here we are the world's largest producer of both soy and corn. I am not concerned about your input streams. Maybe I'm a little concerned about the pricing structure. I think that's unavoidable. But if you only take one thing away from this presentation, take this. Most of your competition will not be there in 3 years. We're at that point now. Okay, let's start with the war. Yeah, everyone's like, now, here are some maps of the Central Russian space. You have to turn your head a little bit because they're from the books. That's okay, I'm not gonna judge out loud. This is a population density map, and that V of light orange going from Central Europe down into Central Siberia, that is where all the Russians live. That is the only part of the Russian space where the climate is tolerable. So in the winter, you're talking northern Minnesota in terms of temperature with the aridity of western Kansas, and that's as good as it gets in Russia. That's where you live. Whoa. The light orange is roughly a population density of the eastern half of Nebraska if you melon scoop out Lincoln and Omaha. So you have neighbors, you know their names, you don't see them every week, okay? That's where everyone lives. Now, if you go over to this map, same area, that's, the orange here is overlaid by the green here. This is an economic and climate map. And that green is the Russian wheat belt. That is home to roughly 95% of their agricultural production because it's the only place that the land doesn't completely suck. If you move to the right, to the blue, you get tundra and taiga, think northern Canada, with worse food. If you go to the left, you go to the yellow, you're in desert, think Phoenix, without retirees. Okay? When Russians look at this, they get really depressed, not because of the bad food or the bad weather, but because of the beige. Because the beige is flat, it's open, but it's dry, and it's either too hot or too cold. You can't really live there, you can't grow anything, there's no population. But if you have a Mongol horde or a Panzer division, you can just roll right through that territory and go right into the green. And so the Russians have been invaded 50-odd times in their history because they can't defend it. Their population density is low. They can't do a mobile defense because they can't afford it. They can't even build the roads. Russia still doesn't have a road network. They've got a rail network. Now, the Russian goal since the time of Catherine the Great has been to expand beyond the green and through the beige until they get to these red arcs. These are the zones where you cannot run a Mongol horde. There's mountains, or they're too deserty, or there's water. And then they want to forward position static troops, because they don't have mobile troops, static troops, in the gateway access points between those barriers. There's 9 of them. Under the Soviet period, the Russians controlled all 9 for the first time in their history, most secure they've ever been. Soviet Union collapsed in '92. They went from 9 to 1. And everything that the Russians have done under Putin since has been about getting boots on the ground in the other 8. This is the Georgia War. This is the Kazakh intervention. This is the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is the Crimea war a few years ago. Ukraine isn't the end, it's the mid-step. And even worse, it's not that the Russians aren't going to stop until they have all of Ukraine, because Ukraine is not in one of these gateways. It's on the way to 2 of them, though. So it's not that the Russians are not going to stop until they have all of Ukraine, it's that the Russians will not stop when they have all of Ukraine. This war was always going to happen. Without it, the Russians die. We all know a Texan, right? And they just won't shut up how big their state is. Texas is not as big as they think. Russia has borders 3 times the size of ours. They're trying to defend them with half the population and without a road network. This is the only way to make it work. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on right now. The deep red are the zones that the Russians controlled on February 22nd when the war began. The pink are the areas that they have grabbed since. There's 4 big things going on. First of all, that initial assault that we saw from Belarus down to Kiev. I need to snag my water here. Thank you. You drink it, did you? This is safe. All right. You guys remember that giant convoy, 40 miles long? APCs, tanks, military vehicles? Remember how it stalled on day 3 of the war because they forgot fuel trucks? Most people missed that on day 7 of the war, most of the soldiers had to dismount from their equipment and walk back to Belarus because they also forgot food supplies. Now, my buddies at the Defense Department were like really excited when this happened. Like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. If we ever fight them directly, we're just gonna wipe the floor with them. And then they all had a nap and some bourbon and really thought some deep thoughts about it. Like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. If we ever face them directly, we're gonna wipe the floor with them. And they see this as an existential conflict for their very survival, which means nukes come into play almost immediately. We can't let that happen. Sure, Star Wars has come a long way in the last 30 years. It's not that good. The Russians have over 1,000 nukes. We can't allow that direct fight to happen. And since we know they won't stop when they have all of Ukraine, that they're coming for countries to the west, all of which are in NATO, and so we are treaty bound to defend them, we have to make sure that that never happens. We have to kill the Russian military here and now so that it can never act again. And that means every weapon system that we possess, that we can train the Ukrainians on in a short period of time, they can have. So no jets, no F-35s, no battleships, no advanced systems, because that would just take too long. Anything else is game. There's a problem though. Those systems exist in limited volume because we, for the most part, don't use them ourselves. We don't use Stingers because we have a freaking Air Force. Use Stingers when you don't have an Air Force. We don't use Javelins because we have tank divisions. At current rates, we're gonna run out of stuff to give them within the year. We don't even make Stingers anymore. The last government order for that was 11 years ago. We're rebuilding the supply chains as quickly as we can. But just replacing the Javelins that we've already given them would take 3.5 years. There's a time issue. Okay, now obviously that assault failed. The second big push started from the occupied territories and converged on the city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Now obviously this is important from the point of view that it's a land bridge, but most people don't understand just how critical that is for the Russians. The Russians don't fight via truck. They're not a mobile warfare military. They fight by train. And that makes this the most strategic asset in the conflict to date. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. They built it after the Crimea War back in 2014, I think, yeah, 14. It's a rail bridge that connects Crimea directly to mainland Russia. Uh-oh. I think we've run out of, oh, there we go. I'll just move over there if I have to. The Russians fight by train, and this is the supply point for the 2 million Russians who live in occupied Crimea. Crimea is not Missouri. It imports all of its food. It's arid. It imports all of its food from the Russian mainland. It's one bridge. And now that we're getting more capable weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians, the Kerch Bridge is probably not long for this world. And if it falls, their only line of supply to their population in Crimea and the entire western part of the front is okay, I'm gonna switch back, guys. I'll just stand over here for a while, unless that's detachable. This one on? Maybe? Can you hear me? There we go. Wow, that's a really short cord. Okay. Okay, so the only way that Ukraine can win this is if number one, they take out the bridge, and number two, they recapture Mariupol, and they have to do it this calendar year. If they fail to do it this year, they run out of gear. And we've all seen the hilarious videos about how badly the Russians are doing and how they're dusting off tanks that were now made in the 60s because they ran out of the good stuff. But riddle me this. In a contest between badly trained, badly equipped Russian forces with tanks that are 40 years old, or highly motivated, lightly trained Ukrainian infantry with no weapons, who wins? You know, there's no math here. And then it becomes a partisan conflict. And we're not the only ones who took some lessons away from the Battle of Kyiv. The third big push is here. The Russians are trying to turn this into a pocket, advancing from the south and the north to trap the most advanced, best trained, best equipped Ukrainian forces into a pocket that they can then destroy. Their lesson from the Battle of Kyiv was that they're not going to be welcomed in as saviors after all. And that means the entire population is forfeit. And so the Russians have dusted off a strategy that they developed back before World War I. They recreated for the wars in Chechnya and in the Syrian civil war with the devastation of Aleppo. And they are using their artillery to advance very, very slowly under a hail of incendiary fire, deliberately targeting every piece of civilian infrastructure they can see, with an emphasis on agricultural infrastructure. Cold chain, ports, grain silos, tractors. They've got lots of reasons to go after tractors. Oh, come on, that was hilarious. You guys, there are hedges now in front of the Ministry of Defense in Kyiv that they have carved to be a Ukrainian tractor dragging a Russian tank. It's hilarious. Anyway, hi. Oh, sure. Here you go. Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, cables. Okay. Everything's forfeit. The goal here is to force the population of Ukraine to self-separate into two groups. The first group become refugees. You never have to worry about them again. Anyone who stays behind is clearly a fighter, and you can shoot them on sight. So they've brought in the Wagner group, which is their mercenary group, and they've brought in the Chechens to basically sweep any population centers that they've captured. We now know from both the operations north of Kyiv and near Kharkiv, as well as radio intercepts by the Germans, that what happened in Bucha, the war crimes, has happened in at least 70 other populated areas. We just can't confirm it because most of them are behind Russian lines. Fourth. Shit. We might need another battery. It's not working on here. Is it on this guy? You did. Okay. Do I? Yeah, it's giving me the low battery thing. So, but is it this? There we go. Okay. Here, that's for you too. Okay. Isn't this fun? No, it's that Canadian guy. They take everything. Okay. All right, so finally, this is Odessa. Now, Odessa is not a normal city. It is at the mouth of the Dnieper River, which is kind of their equivalent to the Mississippi. And it is also their manufacturing center. It's a cultural hub. It's a financial center. So it is New York and Houston and St. Louis and Chicago and New Orleans all in one. And if the Russians succeed in capturing it, that is the end of Ukraine as a modern economic entity. Right now, Odessa is under blockade. They can't export anything. This has been the source of 95% of their exports to this point. At maximum hope, they can send 10 to 15% of their stuff out via rail to Europe. That's assuming everything goes right and the Russians stop targeting rail systems. 10 to 15%, that's as good as it gets. That's not great. Okay. What's next? There we go. If you treat the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians as a single entity, and from an economic point of view in warfare, that's the best way to do it. Everything in the first column, they are collectively the world's largest exporter, and then second in the second column, and so on. I could spend 6 hours on this. I have. I want to just focus on three main points. First of all, energy. This isn't North Dakota. I mean, yes, North Dakota is just balls cold, but Siberia is a whole other thing. It's got something called permafrost, where if you go down 5 feet, the ground is frozen solid for the 20 feet below that. You guys are in the Midwest. You get it. In the winter, if you move, you're okay, but if you stop, you die. Same in the permafrost. Oil that's moving through the permafrost zone up out of the ground, if for whatever reason it has to stop, because of boycotts, because of sanctions, because of infrastructure damage, doesn't matter why, it freezes in the pipe. And water comes up as a byproduct of oil production. All good? Woohoo!
Should be good.
Thank you. And the pipes crack. And you can never use that system again. The last time we had a shutoff in the Russian export system was 1992 when the Soviet system collapsed. It took them 30 years to bring it all back online. They didn't finish until last December. So at some point this year, we're going to lose 4 to 6 million barrels a day of Russian crude, and it will never come back. We have not priced that in. Yeah, here's a minor nightmare. The world's #1 wheat exporter has invaded the world's #4 wheat exporter and is systematically destroying the entire agricultural sector deliberately. Russia is going to see inhibitions in its ability to export for multiple reasons, but Ukraine will never be an exporter again. They will probably be a net importer by this point next year. And this is my personal nightmare. Russia isn't simply the world's largest exporter of fertilizers. It's the world's largest exporter of the materials that everyone else uses to make their own fertilizers. We've already seen significant disruptions to the flows. They're going to only get worse moving forward. Specifically, 40% of the world's potash comes from Belarus and Russia combined. Raw potash, forget the fertilizer, just the potash. We'll come back to that. One more minor issue and then we'll get into the big stuff. This was always going to be the last decade of the People's Republic of China. Let's talk about the third most important reason why. We are having government collapse. Chairman Xi has instituted a cult of personality far tighter than any world leader in history, including Mao, including the Chinese emperors of old, including Donald Trump. Okay, that was funny too. He has intimidated into silence or imprisoned or executed everyone within not just the CCP, but the broader system who is capable of independent thought. He no longer has advisors. No one wants to bring him information because they don't know how he's going to react. He has literally shot the messenger so many times that he is making decisions in the dark. Now, this has horrible implications for any economic system, but in a one-man show, it means nothing gets done unless the leader gives you a written order, or you're one of the zealots who sees him on TV and is like, oh, this must be what he meant. So when you see a small army of bureaucrats in head-to-toe surgical stuff out on a runway at an airport with a leaf blower spraying lime to disinfect the runway. That's the kind of policies we're getting out of China now. And of course, COVID. Now, we're in the Midwest. I'm going to guess that there is a diversity of opinions in the room about COVID. Some of us would probably side with vaccines, where others of us think that natural immunity is the way to go. And I think in the privacy of our own homes, when the door is closed and no one's listening, we do think to ourselves, you know, maybe the other side has a point. Okay? Is that safe? China doesn't have these options, and it's not because of government. China was very successful for 2 years at keeping COVID out. No one has natural immunity. And the Chinese domestically generated vaccine doesn't work. It barely worked against the wild strain out of Wuhan, but then we had Alpha and Delta and Omicron B and Omicron Threat Fuchsia 7 or wherever we are. It doesn't work at all versus the new stuff. And Omicron B, the one that is dominant in China and dominant here today, it's the most communicable virus, pathogen that humans have ever struggled with. And the death rate from it is higher than any of the previous strains. And for us, this is a footnote because we all have multiple sources of resistance now, but the Chinese have none. And if they opened, you'd be looking at 5 million deaths in China a month for at least a quarter, minimum. So they can't. Lockdowns are their only policy tool. Shanghai went into lockdown on April 1. They came out on June 1. They nearly went into lockdown again last week. It's a little touch and go right now. We're all familiar with Vegas, right? What happens in Vegas totally leaves Vegas if it's a venereal disease. Yeah. China right now is struggling with an outbreak in Macau, which is their Vegas. So you should be expecting major metropolitan lockdowns across the country within a month. This is China's new normal. They can no longer participate in manufacturing supply chains because they can't keep the factories open. They are prioritizing health. That comes at a cost. Now, they're going to be losing access to Russian crude because of the war. They're losing access to manufacturing and employment because of their health policy. And we're having government failure as a managerial issue. All that really leaves is food security. Now, we all know that they love their pork. And we all remember African swine fever from 3 years ago when they had to cull more hogs than the rest of the world has hogs commercially. Now, they've started to get back in. Well, they've done more than start. They've offered a series of subsidies at the federal and the local levels in order to encourage hog farmers to re-enter the market, but they forgot to abrogate the debts of the hog farmers that went out of business because of ASF. So you've got 2 million dudes like me taking subsidies who have no idea what to do with a pig. And so they're buying food from everywhere in the world, even if it's not appropriate for hogs. So obviously they're going for soy and corn, but they're like getting broken rice out of India and like croissant grade wheat out of France to feed to pigs. Like the least efficient way to do it. And again, 2 million people who have no idea what they're doing. Now, according to Chinese statistics, there has been no ASF in the country for months. She gets it. Yeah. You look at a heat map of where the cases are in East Asia, and like all the borders are like red. But in China, it's everything's fine. They're probably in the midst of a fairly significant outbreak again. The question is how far and how loud does it get before they have to do another absolutely top to bottom mass culling. Whether that happens this year or next year, I don't know, because Chinese data, but we know it's coming. And if they don't have pork, all they've got left is rice. Rice is the most phosphate input intensive, phosphate is the crop that needs the most. Rice is the crop that is most phosphate intensive. Wow, that took like 4 tries. And so the Chinese have traditionally been the world's largest producer and exporter of phosphate because it's a food security issue. Well, they've stopped all exports until further notice. So we've lost potash because of the Ukraine war. We've lost phosphate because of Chinese mismanagement.